What it
Hey,
is.
I think we are live.
Oh, we are. Okay.
Yeah, no worries. Okay, everybody, I want to introduce you. As you know, I'm Clay Olson, but I want to introduce you to a friend, somebody that we have been very excited to kind of get to know a little bit over the last little while, and that's Sam Louie. So thank you so much for joining us. Now, so tell me a little bit about your background, because there's a personal history here. Well, actually, before we dive into that, I found this very fascinating. You actually, before you got into counseling, you actually spent some time as an Emmy Award-winning journalist, going around doing stories on. Talk a little bit about that, because that's really fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, I worked a number of years in television news. So in my career, at least my particular journalism journey, I started off in small cities and then kind of worked my way up, finishing in Los Angeles. And I was able to receive a few awards because I worked at a PBS station that allowed me to do longer format stories on television, which kind of like is not quite that level of prestige like a 60 minutes, but at least given a lot of time. 8 minutes on television was a lot of time. And then part of I guess, my transition was not only doing stories about therapy, men's recovery, addiction, but also starting to understand what was coming up for me, because I was also in therapy due to a lot of, let's just say, cultural issues, to put it mildly. And
Yeah,
eventually I made the transition.
that's so interesting. And you're an author and you're a public speaker. You speak on a lot of diversity issues within the Asian culture, as you mentioned, but you're also an author. You've written 2 books. Is that correct?
Depends how you define book.
Okay,
Yeah,
fair.
I mean, I also wrote a poetry book it's titled Slanted Eyes, the Asian American Poetic Experience.
Yeah,
And
I like that.
so this kind of flows nicely from journalism into mental health, because I tried to write about it, speak about it, and eventually I, I like to create and be creative, and saying the same things over and over didn't really resonate with me. And so I started finding a way to encapsulate some of these really heavy topics, right? When it talks about culture, parenting, trauma, addiction, and encapsulating it into spoken word poetry that is meant to be performed and heard, which I mentioned I would start sharing some of that here too.
Yeah, I want to hear some of that. Talk about how that encapsulates very well kind of your own background history a little bit. Yeah.
Well, we could start with one of the poems that might set the template for
I love it. Let's
understanding.
do it.
So in 2 minutes, you can understand me through one quick poem.
Let's do it. If every speaker could come prepared with a poem to represent them, we'd be good. So let's go there.
So this one is titled, I Am From a Chinese Walk. If you're not familiar, a wok is one of those kind of heavy duty, things that you use to cook in a lot of Asian cultures, stir fry and so forth. Right. Okay. So I'm from a Chinese wok. I am from a Chinese wok of oolong tea and red envelopes. I am from a tiny orange house with matching shag carpet, of bitter melon soup, rock cod fish, and Kentucky fried chicken with a strawberry drink. I am from raindrops falling on cherry trees in our backyard. I'm from weekly Chinatown dinners, pinball at the arcade, and swimming at the lake. I'm from always smiling and happy, even if something's wrong. I'm from don't shake your leg, it's bad luck. Listen to your teachers and stay away from bad people. I'm from the religion of work, make money, and bowing down to dead ancestors. I'm from police sirens outside, keeping all my fears inside. From a childhood ashamed of my heritage as I tried to fit into America. my language, my food, my customs. I'm from Stoicism, no words of affirmation to acknowledge my existence. I'm from kissing actresses on TV with no kisses or hugs at home. I'm from the weight and shame of ancestors, thinking I'm not good enough, the oldest son who's failed. So that's kind of a quick summary and narrative of my life, in short, so to speak.
Yeah. Well, so have you always been a poet? Have you always been creative?
Because I had a young college-age student who was working on some family issues in counseling, and he didn't want to speak to it directly, so he actually started sharing some of his spoken word poetry, and I got very curious about that process. And he was like, no, I just started doing this once these issues started coming up. And then I said, maybe I'll just give this a shot. And so, it started one summer when I was still single, and I would ride my little Vespa scooter to coffee shops and just start putting on the creative juices, and it kind of grew from there.
I love it.
And then I started performing it too, in some of the presentations that I had already been doing to different audiences, and that really spurred more of the need to continue to go down that creative process, because the audiences really resonated with the poetry. Yeah.
Did you find that was a therapeutic in helping you in your own journey?
I would say still is. This is just was the first attempt. I'm not a very good organizer, so I still have all these poems, like, over, like almost another 50 to 100 new poems that I've created since the poetry book. But I just have a hard time kind of organizing and figuring out which ones I really like. And so it's still a part of the, not only the creative process, but also part of my own recovery process.
Wow. I love it. Now, so you're an author. You also wrote Asian Shame and Addiction, Suffering in Silence. And you talk about how shame is unique to the Asian culture. Or it is something that you found to be something that is unique within that culture, and perhaps other cultures. But talk about that culture particularly.
Well, shame is I think most people understand shame to some degree, but when it comes to the Asian cultures are what we call shame-based cultures. I'm only speaking from the Asian side because that's what I know, but I also hear from some other colleagues and peers that Latin American cultures and African cultures and Middle Eastern cultures are also very heavily tied with the cultural shame piece. And so what we mean by that is, kind of in short, when you grow up in a more traditional shame-based culture, your identity is identified with the group. So we call that collectivism in short. Whereas Western, European, and especially American ideals, it's one of individualism. So it's the I that is to be celebrated. It's the I that's to be focused upon. And it goes against everything you know about when it comes to the Asian, at least the Asian way, because you're taught very early on, at least for myself, my parents taught me how to write my name, and the Louis last name is in a lot of Asian names. The last name comes first, so it's Louis, and then my Chinese name is Fu Yan. And they said, well, let's circle this part, the Louis. This is what's the most important. Whatever you do, whatever you say, everything about you is about representing the Louis side of the family. Not just Louis, but think about also your Chinese culture in general, and then the larger Asian group that you're identifying with. So in short, what happens is if you do something, think something, or perform poorly, I mean, this is kind of being extreme, then you could be seen at the, not only have failing yourself, but worse so, you failed your family, your extended family, your dead ancestors, your culture, and then all the other Asian ethnicities too. You may recall, I think what comes to mind offhand is when the Olympics were in Beijing, and how much shame the participants had, the Olympian winners, if they were Chinese and they got either a silver or bronze medal. It wasn't good enough for the country of China.
Now, that's fascinating. I've actually never really thought of it in collectivism versus individualism, as you put it here. I would imagine that there's pros and cons to that, because there is a beauty to the collectivism mentality too. It can kind of turn negative in the way that we're going to be discussing perhaps today, but there is a beauty in that unifying collectivism. Wouldn't you agree?
Yes, the beauty is in the strength of, it's a dual-edged sword. It's the group cohesion and the unifying aspect that's so intrinsic to a lot of collectivist cultures. Unlike maybe more individualistic members of society, it could be hard for them to find like a group. Like if you ever move somewhere, it takes a lot of work to build a network of friends and so on and so forth. But I know for myself as an Asian American, I'm already tied into my Asian subculture. So wherever I go, there's always that unifying piece where I'm already on an intrinsic level connected to another Asian American, even if we come from different socioeconomic backgrounds, different ethnicities, different religions. It doesn't matter, because there's a shared heritage. So the sense of community is so deep that can be the best, greatest, and most meaningful resource a person can have in his or her life. Growing up in a collectivist culture. And you don't want to give that up, right? Obviously you don't want to give that up, nor do you want to jeopardize potentially losing that group affiliation support. And hence when the shame piece comes in, it may be very hard to express that, talk about it, whether it's an addiction or doing poorly in anything or anything major that happens. Because
you're pulling down the entirety of it is kind of the message that is sent.
The potential, and in some cases it actually happens, whether it's with clients or other peers that I know. For example, a generic example, somebody used to be the revered child in the family, revered child as an adult for being the Asian American success, so to speak. Let's say they go through something that's so normalized in society, such as a divorce. If that happens, that brings such a deep sense of shame upon some traditional Asian families that this person could potentially not be invited to family events, not be asked to be even seen with their nuclear family outside of maybe their home, because nobody wants, it's almost like a guilt by association. And it doesn't have to be addiction. It could be somebody suffering from a mental illness. They could have gone through bankruptcy, anything deemed shameful.
Interesting. And I wonder if many of the listeners who maybe are not of that particular culture have felt similarly with their own families and their, perhaps to a different degree, but nonetheless, shame is such a rampant issue within our culture. And the title of this webinar is Breaking Out of the Silence of Shame. And so you have, as we're kind of illustrating here, you have a lot of experience feeling this shame and a lot of experience breaking out of said shame. And I'm really excited to dive in and walk through some of that. But before we dive in, I want to read a quote from your book. If you mind, do you mind if I do?
Yeah. I was going to grab a copy so people can see what it looks like on Amazon.
So here's a quote from your book. Yes, there we go. Asian Shame and Addiction. So
Silence. That's the other subtitle that is very
Suffering in silence.
Sure. You got to suffer in silence.
So here's a part that I want to read. So it says, my life, this is speaking of your own experience, my life was once shackled by shame. I was hiding and afraid to reveal myself to the world. I was fearful that if anyone really knew me, they would leave me. I believed I could not be loved or accepted as I am. I strove to prove to myself and to the world that I was good enough by trying to excel at school, sports, career, and my relationships, including my relationship with God. I would never let anyone see my weaknesses, my fears, or my insecurities. It was the Asian way. It was the American way. And for the most part, I thought it was the only way. I loved how you talked about it. Can you talk a little bit about those emotions that you felt at that time?
Wow. That was a while ago when I wrote this book. When I actually experienced those emotions. And part of the help that I received was finally realizing there was another way to live. And part of it was individual therapy, but a lot of it came in a group context, not only within an Asian American community where I could slowly find trusted friends. I could break out of that and still realize, like, wow, I could still be loved and accepted, even though I'm dealing with my sex addiction, right? I mean, so it was it was really a beautiful time of recovery. Like, I really still have those strong feelings of affiliation and admiration and connectedness, because I was part of a group therapy at the time, where guys were dealing with sex addiction. And at the time, it was still kind of the Wild West when it came to therapy. In terms of like nowadays, people are like, I need to see a specialized sex addiction therapist. And at the time, this guy was a specialist in the sense that had been something that he had been working with and working on, but it was never classified as sex addiction therapy. But it was a bunch of guys that were struggling to some degree with some aspect of addiction. Hi, baby. Okay, there's my baby here. Can you go back to mommy, please? I'm talking to somebody.
That was you?
Yeah, that's me. You know what I could do? It doesn't matter if he's here. I could read a poem that encapsulates this sense of shame. Oh, it's okay. Hey, can you go over there with mommy? I'll talk to you later. Thanks.
If you remember the moment of the reporter, this is reminiscent of that. This is what you get when you have a Saturday morning memories.
Yeah, I thought this was starting at 7 a.m. my time before he woke up. But let me kind of pause for a second and read this. This one actually comes from my it's actually in this particular poetry book. It's about shame, titled Shame. Shame, what it is, unlike guilt, makes your soul wilt. Unlike guilt, shame focuses on blame. Your experience? Pain. No repentance, no contrition, no sincere abolition. All about condemnation. You ask yourself, would you leave if you knew me? Would you scold me? Or would you hold me while I shake uncontrollably? Shame, a cycle of pain, ruptures and fissures. Grace? There's no space. Instead, a race to hide, not to confide. Keeping secrets, keeping pain, being broken, being shamed. Disgracing your nation, facing temptation, experiencing alienation. Cultures clashing, teeth gnashing, self-bashing. Shame, what it is. So that's kind of a nutshell of kind of East and West and how those different components of shame can arise out of somebody's personhood.
You know, a lot of people watching right now and that will watch once this webinar is archived is, a lot of these individuals are feeling enormous amounts of shame because there's, in our culture, regardless of what subcultures you belong to, in our global culture, sex addiction and pornography addiction, there tends to be a lot of shame surrounding it. And so I would love to spend some time with you as you have really dedicated yourself to be an expert, not only within the recovery space, but also particularly around the topic of shame. I would love for us to dive into some practical ways of people to be able to break out of that shame. And I think that it would be helpful to help us distinguish the difference between shame and guilt, because you're not suggesting that, that never feeling bad for our actions, that there is a place for guilt.
Yeah.
Healthy guilt and toxic shame can really send us over the edge. So talk about that difference.
Well, that might be helpful just to understand the differences between guilt and shame. So we have what we call like a healthy sense. Some people might call it healthy shame, but just to keep it clear, I differentiate as guilt being healthy and then shame being more toxic. So guilt, it's about reparation. It's about seeing how you may have done something that you feel guilty about, but there's a desire to reconcile that, repair that. And then when it comes to shame, it's about punishment, right? I deserve to die. I'm no good. And then it turns into this cycle of something is wrong with me. So instead of, let's say, a behavior or a thought, it's external to who I am as a person, to my core. Whereas shame, it's like very deeply entrenched as a part of one's identity. I am the problem. I am defective. I am flawed to the core. Something's wrong with me. So instead of thinking about how I can repair a relationship, whether it's a real relationship with a person, repair your relationship to God or whatever, it's very hard if you're shame bound, because you're only thinking, I'm such a despicable person. I deserve to be punished. That's kind of a very generic way of looking at it, but hopefully that gives some people.
Yeah, like shame is I am bad. Guilt is I've done something.
Right. And it's not, and I like the point that you mentioned, our conscience should be pricked to some degree when we've done something that might be deemed dishonorable to yourself or your family. But not so much so that you feel like you need to hide, that you can never be vulnerable, that it's adding to a sense of inadequacy. That's what we want people to truly break free of when we talk about breaking out of the shame. But it's very difficult because a lot of folks grow up in households and families that either could be at the best case scenario, very loving and well-intentioned, but the environment may not have nurtured what they may have individually needed. And so even in the most loving scenarios down to the most traumatic, I would like to say there are a lot of times folks have gone through some level of trauma that needs to either be identified, resolved, and or at the very least acknowledged. Not minimized, because in an Asian shame-based culture, if you say you grew up in an emotionally neglected family, or I didn't get enough this or that from my parents, that saying that in itself could feel very shameful, because you're bad-mouthing your family. How could you do that, is what I was told when I was first doing all my processing. Like when I was in therapy, I would learn all these insights, and I would, bounce some ideas off other people, and like, what, you can't say that about your parents. You can't do that. So it's very difficult, because there's the space that people can hear it can sometimes be limited, and you need to find safe spaces where, like, yeah, you know what? I'm not saying my parents are bad people or that they weren't well-intentioned. I just need to acknowledge that I have a loss here that I need to grieve. Might not come out in these ways, but like eventually this is what the person may be signifying to others. And is it okay for me to even say that? And so, a lot of times people don't even know what trauma is. And so if you don't know what trauma is, or if you're not sure like how to even articulate it, I have another poem for that. I don't know if it's appropriate to share it now, but why not? This one's called Childhood Trauma. And it kind of starts with, more specific traumas that a lot of people can acknowledge. And then in the poem, you'll flow and you'll see how there are other nuanced versions of trauma that people might say, that's trauma? But, therapeutically, we would say it is. Beaten, stabbed, molested. Trauma shouldn't go uncontested. Assaults on your thoughts and emotions. No hugs or kisses. Mom and dad dismissive. Don't be weak. What's wrong with you? You're a kid. You have no right to speak. This is still trauma. We know it to be true when you shout and scream at kids as young as 2. Set high standards for grades in school, yet without love, kids won't understand the rules. Punishment, timeout, you're grounded. No explanations except I'm the head of the house. Children may succeed, do well at school, but deep down inside, question their worth. Trust is hard as emotions get neglected. Bonding in childhood, never corrected. Children need love more than food on the table or a roof over their heads to know that they matter, lest their true selves get shattered. Saying I love you is not easy to do, especially when cultures say that's just too taboo. If you're scared, hurt, or lonely, will someone take time to listen? Or will you get teased and compared to the proverbial chicken? Sticks and stones do hurt, but words can hurt even more, especially if you know trauma more than feeling adored.
Mm-hmm. I love that. Now, talk a little bit about, if you wouldn't mind, I can just sense shame being such a crippling thing within someone's recovery.
How do you break that?
How do you even begin to remove yourself? We've talked a little bit about that, but how do you begin this process of breaking out of this silence of shame?
During my recovery process, there was no such thing as social media, right? Like that, there wasn't as much support, so I needed real life, person-to-person interactions. In today's socially connected world, I feel like there are a lot more avenues, such as Fortify, right? All the different online resources that are available. Everybody's built differently, and I'm looking at some of the comments that are coming up. Everybody has a different means of accessing a way out of that. Some people could use creative arts to start. Some people could, be as traditional as going to therapy, right? Some people, it could mean talking to a role model or a peer to at least, let's back up for a second, Clay. When you said, I think the first thing is you have to be able to acknowledge that there is an aspect of your life that needs to be processed, worked through, or some space just to hold it. And I've been in a lot of different groups, therapeutic or otherwise, that still had therapeutic value. It might not have been technically therapy, workshops and such, where your story can at least be told, stories can be shared, feelings can be acknowledged and validated. That is just so important to the human experience. And so if somebody has found those avenues and at least has the courage to acknowledge that this has occurred in their life, they're on the right track. Think about the Me Too movement, right? All the sexual assaults that have occurred. And people say, well, why now? Why is it coming out now? Well, they have finally found enough of a critical mass, so to speak, where they feel supported. You might not even know another person personally know somebody who's been sexually assaulted or worse, but knowing that there's a movement out there that supports you can be very encouraging, validating, and giving you the extra push towards courageously working through those issues.
Yeah. So, when you're when you're working with individuals, and you have your own practice, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So when you're working with individuals and talking to them, does self-esteem come up as something that you need to work with them on? Is something that is that a precursor or a result to individuals feeling shame?
I think a lack of self-esteem is a result of the shame-bound environment. And so, we use this term self-esteem a lot, and people need to remember, where do you think self-esteem comes from, right? It comes from others. So I try to help inform folks that self-esteem is not, this person who has good self-esteem is not because he somehow self-inflated him or herself. It's because it was an other esteem that was bestowed upon this person to make him or her have the sense of resiliency, to be able to combat the things that can come at one person's life. But yeah, I mean, self-esteem, people don't really, very rarely do people come in saying, I need to work on my self-esteem, because self-esteem is integrated, or it's a part of so many other areas of life, So if you're working on your relationship, or if you're working on your job and, kind of lost in your job, or you want to follow your passion or something like that, it can all be tied into how do I have the courage or the self-esteem or the other esteem so that I can move in this direction that I want to. I see clients all the time who might struggle with something. It doesn't have to be an addiction per se. It could just be, maybe I don't feel validated enough by my partner. We had children, and then one partner or another spent so much time devoted to raising the children that I took a really personal hit in terms of feeling loved, right? It could be something as mild as that would require some level of, help in terms of giving them another pair of eyes. How do you see things differently? But yeah, you also have to tease out parts of their childhood to see how much was neglected and how much emotional nourishment can be repaired in the relationship that they might need to work on, or how much emotional nourishment needs to come from within, right? How do we build in some resiliency to know that, hey, when my partner is taking care of the children, it's not that he or she loves me less. I may feel that way, but what's the reality? Where does this comes from? And obviously major life events can trigger wounds from the past to start, and it could be seen front and center in your life. So if you grew up deprived, and then you emotionally deprived, and then you end up in a very nurturing relationship, but then if that nurturing relationship for one reason or another is not at that level or threshold you think that it started at, then you may feel there's less love or less nourishment. And, that's kind of just one example of how to answer that question.
Okay, so an individual that's struggling with a lot of shame, shame can kind of up and down, kind of ebb and flow of like the amount of shame someone feels, and
Sure.
and it might come back for somebody that feels like they kind of got away from it, can come back. And if somebody is feeling those emotions and feelings, as you would likely agree, that can be just completely crippling to anybody's recovery process. Recovery is stifled through the existence of strong shame emotions existing. So what practical strategies would you provide to somebody, if you're working with them, to kind of like stop and recognize where these are coming from, and how, lifting those away and pushing them aside?
Clay, you're asking for practical, specific. Everybody's so different, and I'm not trying to be evasive here, because when somebody comes in and they might want practical advice, I might give them some ideas like, okay, you're talking about a lot of shame from childhood. Why don't we do this? why don't you give me a short narrative of, write something about your childhood? Or it might be, that might be too broad. I was like, hey, I'm sensing some shame coming from the way your interactions with dad happened. Let's write a Dear Dad letter. You know, dad, not to be shared with, you know, dad, it's to be done therapeutically. It could be Dear Mom. It could be something like, let's write a dear.
With them, it's something that maybe it's just kind of like a process of writing it just for your own experience that may or may not be actually given to this.
Yeah, 9 times out of 10, that's not the purpose. It's meant to be shared here because I'm trying to see how much are you, because it's kind of like therapy is a two-way process where it's not me just on the throttle all the time. I have to gauge work at the client's pace. So the client might be receptive to one idea. It's like, okay, you want to work on this? Write it. Let me see what you come back with. Some may only want to broach so far, so only so much material or information or emotions is shared, right? Some may go deeper, and depending on what's given, it's kind of like if I was like molding clay. Okay, here's a clump of clay. They've given me this much to work with. So I just kind of work with that much. And sometimes they might say, hey, I need a little bit more. And then like one guy I'm working with, dealing with, well, the sex addiction piece, I mentioned, hey, this is great. You know, you're sharing it for the first time in your life with another human being, but it should not ever stop with me. I'm not going to be in your life forever. I need you to start considering, I'd like you to start considering who else in your natural support system, friends, coworkers, maybe even some family members, whom else can you start sharing a little bit? And when I say a little bit, when we talk about breaking out of shame, how much can you share? Can you share that you're in counseling? That in itself could be enough to break some of that shame, just to acknowledge to another human being outside of me, you're in counseling. If that doesn't really raise the threshold of shame, then it's like, well, are you willing to share that you've been struggling with something, right? Like, you know, and I have to modulate it depending on how long they've been in therapy, what their goals are, and where their level of emotional intimacy, vulnerability, and kind of gauge that. One client I've had recently for a few months, I brought it up first, but he eventually says, you know what, but before you even mentioned it, I was thinking this myself. It's like, I think we need to start going to, you need to start considering a group of like-minded peers who are struggling with the sex addiction. I don't care how you do it. I can refer you to other therapists that run group therapies on sex addiction. It could be a 12-step group, but let's get you out there in a community where you can find some level of community is the short and long of it. And in that way, these are all different ways of what we call shame reduction. Because when people first come in with addiction, we're always thinking as therapists, shame reduction, shame reduction, shame reduction. But there's not as much of a cut and dry method of it. So
I totally understand that. And you've kind of come back to this, and you've even written about community. Does silence perpetuate shame?
Yeah, I think in one of my presentations, I did a presentation back in the summer or actually it was last summer, primarily from a Mandarin speaking group from China. And they wanted to hear about Asian shame. These are folks who just wanted an understanding of it. They may be going down the therapy or counseling realm, but maybe not so. They're not academics per se, but they wanted a better understanding. So I gave them different exercises where they could first tap into their own shame. Some examples could include phototherapy or some of the creative artistic means of tapping into areas that are harder to share just directly, but maybe indirectly. Here's a bunch of pictures on the floor. Choose a picture that represents your childhood, right? Something mild, and then slowly ramping up. Choose a picture that represents your sense of shame. So some people might choose an image of a deflated tire. Some people might choose shattered glass. Some people might choose a guy hanging by his fingernails off of a cliff to describe the level of intensity. So it's a very kind of an unconscious way of accessing their shame, because these are more workshops than therapy, but it still can address their level of shame. I didn't answer your question. I do know that. So please repeat the question again.
Well, does silence perpetuate shame? Does the process of getting accountable and opening up to whatever is comfortable, does that process alone, does that experience alone start to minimize shame just out of the gate?
Well, we believe so. You have to articulate it to somebody. Otherwise, if you suffer in silence, which is the subtitle of the book, at least for Asian cultures, here's where you could end up. Having mildly some mental health issues. You could have addiction issues. It could go all the way to the threshold of suicide, because suicide in Asian cultures is very different from Western culture. Suicide, think about the samurai and when he impales himself, that's a way to regain your sense of honor for the family. So suicide, kind of more in general, if you—
it's almost an honorable thing.
Yeah, it's a way to regain your lost sense of shame, not only for you, but for your family. So Japan they still do, had an extremely high rate of suicide. My brother lived in Japan at one point and told me about, all the folks who would jump in front of the subway system, subways. Korea, and these are the countries that I'm familiar with, Korea and then China, also with such a high level of shame, a lot of suicides. And this one is more related to academic shame, right? Not getting into the school of choice or not meeting some level of standard that society or maybe the family or culture had wanted for the child. So then there's no way out. So yeah, silence is more or less deadly.
Yeah. And so it's critical. And in your work, you help them recognize that and help them find the appropriate avenues to which they can kind of break out of that silence, which in turn will help start the process of breaking out of the shame.
Yeah, believe it or not, clients have a lot more intuition and insight than ever before because they have so many resources. I mean, back then it was like, here, read this book on such and such issue. Now there are blogs, there's, webinars such as these, there's podcasts, the recovery material, or not only the recovery material, but all the materials and resources that are available to the person who's dealing with anything these days. It can actually be overwhelming. There's so much out there. But it's a great— I'd rather have that than have less of it. I'm noticing that we probably have about 15 or 20 minutes left. I don't know if it's helpful for the audience, if it wasn't already mentioned that, I grew up in a traditional Chinese culture, born in Hong Kong. Parents immigrated to the Seattle area when I was 4 or 5 years old. And early on, I'm growing up in a household where I'm inculcated with traditional Asian values, but then every day at school, I'm being told to speak up. What are you thinking about this? Ask questions, challenge authority, right? It's okay to think for yourself. And all of these ideals go countercultural when I return back home. Do not speak up. You're a child. Everything is based on rank. And to give you a sense of rank and title, people don't address each other by first names unless they're very Americanized. We don't say hi Sam or hi Ken, me and my brothers, right? In a more traditional setting, we would address everybody by a title. They would address me as big brother in Chinese. I would address them as little brother, depending on where they are in the birth order. My father is the oldest of 7. So whenever I'm around my uncles and my aunt, they call him Dai Go, which in Cantonese is translated to mean big brother. And then each person has their own
Title.
name, so to speak. Yi Suk means the second oldest uncle, and then the third oldest uncle. They're not talking to each other in first names, which is kind of baffling to most people, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that's how relationships are. And you saw my son when he goes out with my parents and the family outings, he's learning everybody's title. Call this person this, call this person that. You know what I mean? Mm. You're your grandmother on this side of the family. I mean, that's how much it's differentiated that it can be very confusing. Mm. But that's the title side. Eventually, growing up in a world where I didn't get to share my emotions or had very few outlets. My parents are immigrants, so they can only speak one language, and I'm learning English, which is my primary language. I can't, even if they wanted to, it couldn't work, right? They could speak Cantonese to me, and I could try to speak Chinese, but there was going to be some disconnect with the language piece. So early on, I would find other means of, I don't want to use the word acting out per se, but I needed to find another way to disconnect. So a lot of folks who are in recovery would look back on their childhoods and be able to say, yeah, I did a lot of this, and I know it was compulsive and it wasn't healthy for me, even though on the surface it could be healthy. So I played a lot of basketball. And if it's raining outside, it's cold, it doesn't matter. I just want to get out of the house because I didn't feel any sense of emotional connection to the house. So I just spent my hours compulsively, shooting a ball at a hoop. It could be compulsively listening to music just to drown out whatever it was, right? I mean, little things here and there eventually made a mark. And then like you would go shopping and then you get not a high, but you realize that this kind of took you out of whatever funk you were in. And eventually, once I found pornography and sex, it just took it to a whole new level, that finally it took a divorce, almost 15 years ago, that got me into therapy, that made me kind of I finally had to grieve something that was so painful, that was allowable by society. It's not allowable in Asian cultures to say, I want to grieve my childhood, right? But if you have going through something significant like a divorce, even that was hard, but I had some peers whom I respected and had gone to therapy and say, hey, we really think this could be helpful for you. I did it, and all the other different pieces started to fit together. But it's hard because there's a mentality that, not a mentality, but you have to really watch how the addictive mindset can sometimes kick in when you're in a bad place. So you always have to be mindful of that. I think I might want to share this one piece. This one's very short. It's titled Dopamine Predator, to kind of describe the mentality of the addiction mindset. So dopamine predator. Dopamine, a cascade of chemical pleasure. Food, sex, booze, caffeine. The chase for a fix. The remedy for my pain. A salve for my suffering. But it's temporary. Yet the need for a hit consumes interminably. Like a lion on the prowl, searching for prey. The addict scours the earth, desperately searching for more. In this world of predator and prey, the addict eventually discovers he is both. Now, I don't even know if that makes sense, but it sounded good when I wrote it, so I kept it. That's how poetry is sometimes. And yes, I am Asian. I'm 100% Chinese from Hong Kong. Some of the comments wondering if I'm Asian.
Okay. Well, that poem. I thought it made sense. So I actually love it. It really articulates that kind of that control and that power, that seeking of that dopamine and that rush. And I think we all have felt completely enslaved to that desire at times, and I appreciate that. Now, I so wish we had more time because there's so many other things I want to ask, but
we started a little late. We could go 5 minutes over.
We could, and I think that I'm okay with that. Let me ask you this. In all the work you've done over the years, is there something that kind of a common thread that you see with individuals experiencing shame? Is there something that you've noticed throughout all of it that you say, if they could just understand one thing, if they could just kind of grasp this one piece, it could really help to unlock? Is there anything of that nature that kind of is pivotal or paramount or foundational to somebody's process? Or the details can be so individualistic and unique, but is there kind of a common thread that you've noticed?
Yeah, I think this sense of unconditional love, or knowing that you're good enough, it's not a intellectual understanding. It has to be an emotional, heartfelt experience. When that happens, there's a huge transformation. And I think I realized it for me because I went through the divorce. I was dealing with the sex addiction, and sex included not only pornography, but it had escalated all the way to prostitutes too, right? So covered the gamut. So the divorce was happening, the addiction was happening, or was so shameful because I didn't understand it. I just thought I was a bad person. This is why I did what I did, because I'm a bad person. But once I realized and started understanding, no, I'm not a bad person. I just started doing all these things to cope. And the reason why I wrote that poem earlier, to make it broader definition of addiction, so people don't just fixate on drugs, alcohol, or sex, like the hard stuff. Like, it can include food, right? It can include caffeine. It can include exercise. Mm-hmm. It can include a lot of benign things that we take for granted. It could be work, right? But anything where you're doing something to disconnect from yourself, to feel better about yourself, as well as losing my job in Los Angeles as a reporter. So I was like spiraling around with no sense of identity, right? Nothing. But I still had a really deep group of men and women who still cared for me for who I was. And that was transformational. So I said, well, I don't have to be, this person working in this career to get your acceptance. Because I was kind of unemployed and just working a lot of odd jobs, at restaurants, and you know what I mean? Like, just doing a lot of stuff. And I was okay. I was okay. And that's when it really stuck. And I felt really proud that even though I was living in like a 300 square foot studio apartment with a Murphy bed, for those who don't know what a Murphy bed, it just pulls out of the wall, that I was still cared for. And I felt, that was a real blessed time for me of recovery.
Oh, I love that. It's beautiful. And I think anybody watching this right now, I think that would be such a prime message for you to sink in, for all of you, that you are worthy of love and connection, and that you're worthy of acceptance in the community. And if you can't yet find that yet out there, we can, here in the Fortified community, we love you and we support you, and you are worthy of our time and attention. And so I hope people grasp that. And I'm so glad that you brought that up, because I think that is pivotal. That is foundational to overcoming addiction in general, and particularly overcoming the shame piece of that.
Oh, here's one. It's actually, this might be a good way to end it. It's actually titled Good Enough. I thought I wrote something like this.
Yes.
Good enough, competency, adequacy, feeling good enough, always eluding me. Compared to others, I end up short, not quite making the cut academically, financially, relationally, or spiritually. Shockingly, I was never good enough, according to God. Yet by grace through faith, I'm redeemed entirely. So a little bit of a pivot there in terms of good enough, but I hope people kind of understand we need to stop chasing these things to feel good enough and to recognize that we just are.
Yeah, and not, hopefully not too much of a deviation to the topic. I've always thought about happiness, and so much about happiness comes from a feeling of being good enough and feeling content, and we often chase happiness. Happiness always exists around the corner. As soon as I graduate, as soon as I get that job, as soon as I get that promotion, as soon as I get married, as soon as I have that house, as soon as I get that car, it's always as soon as, the time now is always kind of like, not quite, but as soon as X occurs or happens, or I get rid of this, or I move on from that, that's where happiness exists. And the key to happiness isn't any of those things, as you're saying. The key to happiness is looking at the here and now and recognizing that happiness comes from within. It's so I love that. I hope that's not too much of a deviation to bring.
No. I was going to expound on that too, because a lot of people think I got to do this or do that. But I think this might be very self-helpy, but like, how do we tap back into our core to know what nourishes us? So I know for myself that what really nourishes me is when I'm creating. And I know I talked about creating, whether it's a blog or even when I create a PowerPoint and I'm speaking, that there's a creative process there. But I told my wife it could be as simple as creating a new, we bought an Instant Pot recently. So just creating like a meal could feel very creative to me, right? It gets my creative juices going. Writing a newsletter at work or something like that. Like those are all components that I know make me feel really fulfilled and content, and it has nothing to do with dollar signs or anything like that, because if you're just thinking about external rewards, then as you said, it's going to be a mirage that you'll never be able to
it's always around
grasp.
Amen. I love it.
I know we never got to the slides. I don't know if it's worth mentioning that, or just because a lot of people say, okay, I heard a lot about Asian shame, but what does that mean?
Okay.
So one quote that just as much as like Eskimos have all these different words to describe snow and ice, in the Chinese culture, researchers have found there are more than 113 terms that are related to shame in the Chinese culture. One of those terms, I'll read it to you. So ashamed that the ancestors of 8 generations can still feel it. So I thought my shame was bad. Like, oh my gosh, I'm shaming, my family, up to my grandparents. When I talk to folks from China, like, no, we've heard this spoken to us going back 8 generations. And it's on a different way. It's kind of similar, but different to how Native Americans view conservation and how they have a phrase, I think it's called the 7th generation principle, where what you do in this life impacts the world for 7 future generations. They're referring more to what you do to the environment and how to conserve and take care of Earth and its natural resources. Whereas with the Asian culture, and specifically Chinese, when we talk about they're going back 8 generations, and what you do today can reflect negatively in that respect. But anyways, that could be a teaser for the future.
Okay. Looking forward to it. Sam, thank you so much. And I think that the parting words, that the message of all this, of part 1 at least, is take a moment, breathe, and recognize that you are worthy. You are good enough, and that we love you.
I appreciate this forum because I've done some webinars here and there, but I really love this platform of seeing the live feed come up. It's very interactive. So I just want to applaud the work that you all are doing on your end to not only get the word out, but also provide a community of sorts for people.
Well, I appreciate that. And we're continuously working to improve it. So I appreciate it. And Sam, let's get together again. Is that okay?
Okay, sounds good. Appreciate it.
Thank you guys
Thanks
so much.
everybody for listening in.
Okay, bye-bye.
Now I tend my little professor.
Yeah.
Austin.
See you later. Bye-bye.
Bye now.